said, we've got a concerto start. He said, we have these Hindenburg recitals. They were Bösendorfer recitals. They had this Bösendorfer, didn't they? This enormous tank of a piano. And and he said, well, you really ought to use Massa. I said, okay, all right, fine. And I went, and we just got on like a house. It was just a marvellous, because there's one thing about Massa that's quite unique, and that he can actually play the piano and play the notes. It's sort of the Andre Previn. He can actually, he does play the notes all in the right order, which is in that sense, which is really rather lovely. No, it's true actually, because I was going to say something about that in a minute as well. Right. Thanks, Massa.
Right. Well, there we are. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, I will stand up because that's used to standing up in this profession. Yes, it's an extraordinary story about conducting, and I've got about just under an hour to just try and do a resume of what it's about, what we do. For a lot of people, it is quite a mystery, what it's all about. I call this the art of course conducting, really, because it's that the joke is the art of course fishing, in that you fling a fishing rod out, and you're flinging this out, and my teacher, Sir Adrian Boult, used to have this great long baton, much longer than those on there, and he used to flick it around, and it was a bit like as if he was flicking a fly, doing fly fishing with it. So I call it the art of course. It was a wonderful. I did this talk in Ilford once to me, and the local paper thought that it was actually a mistake, and they actually called the talk the art of course fly fishing, because they thought it was actually a mistake, and they corrected it, but it wasn't. They missed the joke completely, such as it is. Are conductors necessary? Yes, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'd hope to think that one was being paid for a position. A lot of people are very sceptical about it, and it has to be said, at times, if the Martians landed, what is this man doing? You spend your time waving a white stick around in public and hopefully being paid for it, and sometimes annoying players and all those sorts of things that come into it. But it is a very vague sort of profession, and it can be misused and abused in a way, because it can be seen as the last bastion, if you like, of power. You're in charge, or we are these days in charge of a group of musicians, and hopefully with some cooperation you're basically telling them how you would like the music to go. That's basically what it boils down to, and you can do that either by force of personality, by what you do with your baton, with what you do with your preparation. You can persuade the players and the instrument, who may well have got a lot more experience than you, and therein lies the nub of the problem. To do the job, you need to be able to do it and get to do it. And of course, I mean, I when I was my early teenage years in 16, 17, and that I listened to the Proms, and there I was with a score flailing around in the front room at home, conducting to the broadcast, or conducting to records. Well, of course, that's very nice, because the record's doing what you're doing, what the record, you're not actually leading it, but it does help in a way to actually try and get some idea about what gestures and things you do to actually do it. But the actual business of relating to players and what you do is part of the great conundrum of how you approach the whole art of conducting in the first place. Bernstein Leonard Bernstein was one of the great musician conductors of all time, and Bernstein said it was the only profession where you got paid for having a fit in public. And Hans Keller, who was a very severe critic, turned around and said, it's a bit of a fraudulent occupation, really. He was very anti it. And while we're going along, if I do mention anything, I do see this, that somebody's puzzled by something I've said or do. Let's talk about, do ask a question. Don't just, feel free if I'm saying something, because it's always difficult to pitch this, because you could talk about people when you live a world. I mean, I've conducted for nearly 60 years, and when you live a world like that, and you've been doing it very young, and you live it in it, you take so many things for granted about how you talk about the music, and you can't just assume that everybody knows A, the names, and B, what you're talking. So if anybody's puzzled, please do say so. What is important to bear in mind is that there is a technique in the way you approach what you do as a conductor, with either your hands or the stick or whatever, or what you do. There is technique. Massa's great hero, Rachmaninoff, we were on this wonderful boat named Rachmaninoff, actually said that interpretation comes with technique. In other words, I think he was basically saying that you have to be able to do it. In other words, to be able to relate to how you want it to go. There's an awful lot of talk about it, but unless you can actually do it with your technique as a conductor and control the proceedings and how it's going to go, you're not really doing what you see as your interpretation, and you're getting through it in some way, but it's not really the way you go unless you can actually control it some way or another, that you can do it. And it's done in a lot of different ways. I also like to illustrate some of the things that that have meant a lot to me, as in music, and what were for me wonderful musical experiences and performances. Around now 50 years ago, I sang a lot with the London Symphony Orchestra Chorus, and sang because when I came to the Academy, I wanted to conduct, and I wasn't allowed on the conductor's course for a year. You weren't allowed on it until you got established there, and so I got my own orchestra going. Simon Rattle was my timpanist, and we were there together, but I joined the LSO chorus, and I sang for many fine conductors, not least Colin Davis, and we sang the Verdi Requiem for Leonard Bernstein in the Albert Hall and in St Paul's Cathedral, and we recorded it. And I'm just going to play you a bit of the recording of the Sanctus from the Requiem, because for me this was a man who literally, by blood, sweat and tears, got exactly what he wanted and created a reading of something in his way. You might not have liked it, but you were completely swept along by the way, the vigor, energy, charisma. I've never known anybody, including Karajan, who I met, come in with such charisma as Bernstein had, and this manner and the way he did it. He came in and he would take the cloak off, and somebody would light him his cigarette, they'd give him his baton, and off he went. And this is the Sanctus from the Requiem, with me somewhere singing in the tenors nearly 50 years ago. Come on. That now you would either with that love it or hate it. I mean, I've never escaped. I've conducted the Verdi since about 4 times myself, and you couldn't escape it. The way that went, it was completely. Now, if the point being is that he imposed so much of his own personality, perhaps, but I still think Verdi would have loved it to bits for its conviction. But it was completely different to the way a conductor called Carlo Maria Giulini would have done it, where I think there was a much more inward, deeply spiritual approach to the way the music went. So, how did all this business about conducting really start? If you go back to the Tudor times, music, madrigals, groups of people together. Music was sometimes printed such that one part would be that way, so that the group of singers would sit round a table and they would sing to one another. They would sing as a group, but they all had their part, and they would see where they were, and they kept themselves together. The basic premise is that groups of people got bigger, music got more organised. Of all time, the Bach B minor mass. There's lots of debate about whether Bach's music was played or sung by a larger number of people, or whether it was individual voices. There's for all the people. I mean, I'm partly interested in the authentic brigade that go on at the moment. I'm a bit old for some of it, but a lot of people are playing with authentic instruments. The fact remains is that we still don't really know what it sounded like. We don't know that. We never will, because we don't know what the standard was like, and there's lots of things in history of music that we don't know. But there is no doubt that as groups got together more, the idea was that you had to have someone in charge, and sometimes it was a leader, but very often in those days there would be a keyboard, what was called a continuo player. Continuous, in other words, to keep the thing going, perhaps, insofar as that if an instrument wasn't well played, there would be someone there to hold the fort, to keep the thing together, and direct from the keyboard, either a portable organ or something, or a harpsichord, and later a fortepiano, where the pianist would be. And down the road, in about 1790, Haydn would be about a mile down the road. Haydn came from Austria to do his symphonies over here, and he directed them he sat in front of a harpsichord and later a fortepiano, and had some say in the direction of it. His leader was the man who ran the orchestra, called Salomon, and he would direct from the violin. In other words, rather like this at 1800, where there is a picture of the performance. And with Beethoven, of course, he was almost completely deaf. And so he couldn't, in fact, when the story goes that when the performance ended, he had to be turned sites in history to see this great man in that situation. But the direction of it, and it was only then in about 1830, 1840 through then, that 3 important figures on the continent got hold of the idea of really directing. Some of it was in Paris with Hector Berlioz, who became for many an eccentric composer, but a man of immense standards of playing and understanding of the orchestra. And he directed concerts in Paris in 1830, his own music most of the time. Came to London, Drury Lane. If you go to the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, Berlioz conducted there in that very theatre, and across the road at the Lyceum as well. And he directed the music with a sort of baton. Wagner came to London and conducted with a roll of paper. And the other person who was very influential in his development of standing in front and directing the proceedings without it was Mendelssohn, who again in London it became an important thing that this guy came along and used some form of authoritative stick like a baton. In those cases, very much like those sergeant major sort of things that you held out in your arm. A story goes that in about 1944, the great composer Richard Strauss was 80, and the Vienna Philharmonic decided to give him a baton in honour, and they gave him one of these silver inlaid ivory batons, and they expected him to conduct one of his pieces with it, and he just about managed to do the quarter of an hour of Don Juan or Thelonious, and just about, and said, put it down. He said, can I have the real thing, a much lighter thing? But the idea of this stick is actually quite new, insofar as that you would get them in about 1870, and the conductor as non-composer gradually grew up to be, and very famous figures, Hans von Bülow, Richter, Hans Richter, a great German conductor who was conducted for Wagner in the 1860s, 1870s, conducted at the Wagner Festival at Bayreuth, but came to London a lot and conducted and premiered much of Elgar. And was respected, but was a conductor as such as a profession. And there weren't that many British conductors around who were actually doing that, but conducting actually with this stick, not always painted white. And also the other thing, of course, in those days that conductors did was that they used to often wear white gloves when they were in a pit as well, so that their hand movements could of course be seen in what was sometimes candlelight and gaslight and that, so that they could actually be seen with what they did. And we know, of course, that Johann Strauss, with his waltzes, carried on leading the proceedings from the violin. But they were all people that knew the music the way it was going. So it was easier to do it that way. But the whole idea of continuo and safety went out in the window gradually, and the orchestra became bigger, grander, and a much more, almost as the sort of Victorian Gothic grew. Like you got these enormous orchestras grew up with their pieces, you've got something that looks like St. Pancras Station. You know, but Beecham said that he didn't like Elgar's First Symphony. So Thomas Beecham was a very rude person and conductor and very witty, but he said that Elgar's First Symphony reminded him of the front of St. Pancras Station, which was a very rude thing to say, really. But the point was that it was like, if you look at that, the size, the complication, the number of things involved, the architecture there sort of didn't really make a living out of it in about 1870. Sorry, almost. It grew up with the personality of the dominant leader. They were notorious about the way they behaved. It's called Furtwängler from Germany, Karl Böhm, Bruno Walter, Otto Klemperer, and of course the great Italian conductor Toscanini, who behaved like a tyrant most of the time. The only person who was born in about 1890 years old that wasn't a tyrant was my teacher, Sir Adrian Boult, who was the most benign, although he had it, as I'd play later on a little, he could have a flare of a temper, but basically he believed he was a musical midwife, and he conducted at the BBC and brought music alive. But generally speaking, these conductors behaved very badly, and the stories are legend in the way they treated the orchestra. And of course, frankly, those days since 1950, 60, those days of temper and stamp his foot on it just to lose, and everybody be horrified that he'd lost his temper. And he worked in New York, and there was this reverence for this appalling way. And the trouble I feel with Toscanini is some of the times is actually that music making, that aggression came out in the music making. And some of the dourness of the dourness sometimes of the German conductors can be like that as well. And they were quite towering, dominating figures. Furtwängler died in 1954. Had a lot of problems whether or not he was associated with the Nazis during the war, and notorious problems with him because he was filmed sort of shaking hands with Hitler at a concert. And to give you an example of the differences between that, the personality of Furtwängler was that he was very terrified and wanted to try and appease everybody all the time. And although he's seen shaking hands with Hitler, you can see the moment he's done that, he wipes his hand down his trousers, which was a symbolic gesture of how to get away with it. Now, the interesting thing about the sort of phlegmatic British conductors, and of course the other person other than Sir Adrian that was mentioned is Sir Thomas Beecham, who got with his money of Beecham's Pills, his father founded and grandfather founded Beecham's Pills. He had money to put his own orchestras and things together, and he had a swagger, and he ruled the roost. But he had a way with him of a sort of benign charm with him. He was wayward, and he had a massive personality and terrific sense of humour, and got away with it. But the interesting thing about the difference between the personalities of the German way of approaching things was this: there was Furtwängler in a concert in 1938 doing that with Hitler. But there was controversially, Beecham took the London Philharmonic Orchestra to Berlin in 1938 for a concert, and they did this concert, and it was broadcast throughout Germany, and in the box was Hitler, and Beecham comes on swaggering on like this, and okay. Anyway, he looks round, and at the end there's Hitler clapping like mad, and Beecham turned to the orchestra and said, "Oh, well, the old bugger seems to like it then," and that was broadcast throughout Germany. That comment. So that shows you the difference there is between that personality who can win people over and make them, and people generally loved playing for Beecham because and I'll show you, I'm going to hopefully have the time to play you a little bit of a rehearsal excerpt of what it's about. So you've got this extraordinary gamut of people that have created this. Now that culture's going. There is much more of a cooperative now, a consensus way of doing things with orchestras. You haven't got those people who are ruling the roost anymore. You've got your star names who will, of course, get there a lot too on publicity, on how they go, on their publicity. I mean, Toscanini didn't need any publicity. He didn't need that sense. It didn't work that way. Times are different, and of course now there are more conductors around now. In my opinion, there are far too many. But the point I'm making, there are more conductors around, partly because we are that much better educated. I mean, my great hero and friend, Sir Colin Davis, who grew up and he started conducting in Ipswich with my father's orchestra. And I knew Colin all his life, and he knew me until he died about 7 or 8 years ago. Colin was a great man, but he started by listening to music, don't forget, on a set of 78 records. I mean, people don't know they're born these days on what they can listen to in terms of repertoire. Most people got to know the music that they could do. They either played a piano transcription of it, and played a version of a symphony orchestra piece. I mean, in my lifetime, and with respect to most of yours, anybody who'd up to 1960, anybody who'd conducted Wagner's Ring had never actually heard it on a recording. So you conducted it learnt it from a piano score, or you imagined it in your head, and you wouldn't have actually heard it on a recording. It was in my lifetime that these things have happened. We've had this extraordinary transformation on what is potentially the knowledge of music for conductors then to actually get to know how to do the music and how to talk about it. You know, I mean, I was doing this talk before CDs. You know, I mean, that we just think, if you think about that, you know, I mean, I remember us going to stereo, for heaven's sake. You know, I mean, that's the point, and I think that's what we have to bear in mind, and how it's influenced what's going on with conductors now. So a little bit more then about it. Now, what I've done here is if we've had a break, when we're finished, I have actually put on here, because I'd like people to now understand a lot more that it isn't just about what you do on the box, or what you do on the podium, or how you conduct rehearsal, or what you do. It's an enormous amount of preparation that goes into to making sure that people can actually play the music. There's some scores here which will have pencil marks on. Now, composers, this score here is Bach. Now, Bach left us with the bare bones of things, and we have to actually, to perform it, we have to actually edit it in a way that we'd like to, how we think it might be played. That means that you've got to have an intuition about how you think the music should go, and you do that with developing a knowledge of understanding of the style. Because what you had, of course, in Bach's day is that when he produced this particular suite for orchestra, he would have been there, rather like Lloyd Webber's there now when he puts on his show. he would be able to be there to supervise what was going on. So you didn't necessarily have to write down to the musicians what you actually did, but you would be there to sort it out. You could say to them, when we do that repeat, guys, when we go back and do that bit again, play it softer. Now that might not appear in the score at all, and Bach they wouldn't think about that. Most of Bach's music there's very little that tells you whether he wants it loud or soft. Never mind any other refinements. Now, by the time you get, of course, to Elgar, and this is this is what you have to work with sometimes, a very small score of that. That's the Elgar's Dream of Gerontius choral work. By the time you get to Elgar in This Is 1900, you've got a composer who's writing, well, it almost tells you how to work the microwave. You know, everything is there. Every detail is there, because he sent that to Richter to conduct, and that score was then there for us to really use and work with and to get the detail. He wrote down exactly what his conception was. And that meant that sometimes you sometimes still have to pencil marks in, put things in the scores, and then what that means is that you've got on that table scores that I would work from with pencil marking in, misprints. There's often mistakes that need to be corrected, and then you go over to this table, and what either you've got then is from those scores you've got the part that people play. Now that again, I'm not going to belittle anybody's knowledge, but that what happens is basically this, is that's a score that will have every line of what everybody does. Now, anybody in a chorus does not, I'm not belittling you, but you probably know this, but in case you don't, the player has their line. The first violins will have their line, or the viola, down here somewhere, their line, and they will then have it printed for themselves on that part. And that is what they play from. They don't play from the whole score, they play that part. And so that's a part of a Mendelssohn symphony. I've just bowed that up with markings how I want it to go with the pencil. That takes a lot of time. That's preparation. That's done before you get, often unpaid, and it's done well before the rehearsal, and certainly well before the concert. You can put things in as you go along in rehearsal. But that's what the players have. And what I've done here is a bit like one I made earlier on Blue Peter. This is an Elgar Overture, the second violin part. That is what is necessary in pencil on that one. I'll leave them on for you to look at, and that is what you get given, and that is then what you actually have to perform it, to play. There's the two different things. There's one marked up and one not marked up, to give you some idea. So, what do you then do? You're deciding on interpretation. I loathe that word. How do you think you want to know the music, how you want it to go? I mean, I don't go out of my way to interpret the music. I take that score and I prefer to use the word, I realize it, I read it, I realize it as I think that it's important, nearest to how the composer would like it to go. And that means a choice of speed, that can be a choice of thing. Now, there are a lot of people who had an incredible will power over what they wanted to do, and they can manipulate the music in an awful lot of ways, and pianists do this as well. Massa will tell you that there are lots of pianists who actually will take a phrase and they'll distort it to make their own expressive way of doing it, rather like an actor can do with the line of To Be or Not to Be. You know, you could have somebody do that. That's what can be done with the line of music. So I want to give you an example of this. Can you play that? I think it's the second. I want you to play the second CD I gave you, which is Mahler 4, and the first. Play the first. I hope you can hear this. This is the first version. Can you just stop it a second and go back? Forgive me. I'd just like to tell you this is an up-to-date recording. This is as we would normally see the score, this is how it would be a standard way of doing it. This is conductor Franz Welser, most with the LPO, recorded about 20 years ago. Right, this is try and listen. Okay, now would you mind, Massa, if we could just go back and play that again, so that our friends can have some perhaps a little memory of it. You know, again, there may be those who are familiar with it, but I'd like you to get this point. Right, now Massa, would you be kind enough to go on to the next CD? Now this is a friend of Mahler's called Mengelberg, conducting in 1939. Now this is how he thought it should go. Because I mean, it's unbelievable that can be the same music with the same instructions could be. This is what I'm saying about people say, you know, what does a conductor do? This is how he thought it should go. And the interesting thing about Mengelberg, he was again a real tyrant, the Concertgebouw, and in fact he was disgraced eventually because he was he went and conducted for Hitler in Berlin as a Dutchman and collaborator, and he never conducted in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam again. But the interesting thing on the old record, on the old record, you can hear him come on the stage, and he actually goes before they start. He goes like they're, you know, tapping on the stand, and off they go. You know, it's literally a military exercise. You know, but that's this. I was talking about my conductor, Sir Adrian, my teacher, and he too. He enormous. I think it was fly fishing, and he'd do this, and he'd flick it. Had a bit of a tough life with the Salvation Army and going away to various wars. Sort of, my family said they'd be nice if I did it, and I did. I did do. I think I managed the overture and put it down rather quickly. But there we go. So let's go on what we're actually talking about when it comes to something to do with the actual art of what we do. The point is, someone has to be in charge of what's going on. At the end of the day, it's about a unifying of personality. I went to a memorial concert for Colin Davis and the LSO and the Barbican when he died, and they played Beethoven's 8th Symphony without a conductor as a tribute to him being on the box. They just about started together. It's great, because I'm not being rude. They started together, but it was extraordinary how there was nobody had really made up their mind how it was going to go. There was no personality behind it. There wasn't anything behind it, for better or for worse, about what happened. Now, you could say, I would say that, wouldn't I? A lot of orchestral players think that most of the time a conductor's a complete waste of space, and they don't want to take any notice of what's going on all the time. They think that because they think they know best. And a lot of them do know them very much. It's very interesting to see those conductors who come out of the orchestral ranks, as it were, and become conductors, and then they somehow then see what the problems actually are, because it's about handling people. It's about dealing with problems and dealing with how things go and how you tactfully deal with it all as well, you know? But in many ways, it's the last bastion of authority. The great Bruno Walter conductor said the conductor is born and then he's made. You have to, I had pupils come to me, no matter how long I would be with them, they wouldn't do it because they hadn't got it. They haven't got the rhythm in their bones. It's like it's funny. I was going to a very musical music camp every year, and there's lots of great musicians there, and but they have a dance, and it's hilarious the number of these great musicians who cannot dance, who have absolutely no sense of rhythm with their feet whatsoever. They can't do it. It's funny. No matter there was a great singer called Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. He was probably the greatest musician that ever was. He tried to conduct. He tried to take up a conducting career. He was awful. He hadn't the clue, and yet he was the best. He told them what he wanted in the music. He knew every nuance. He couldn't do it. It was quite, and so that's what it basically is about. and it's how you make gestures spontaneously about what you want and everything as well. So basically what you're doing is this. You are trying with this stick. You can, of course, many conductors do not use a stick. The great Otto Klemperer didn't use a baton. He'd used his hands, and that would like this in this way. But there was certainly a moment with his hand where the hand was giving the click of where the beat is. So basically what you're doing silently is doing what a metronome does loudly. Donk, donk, something like that. You're doing that. You're tick-tocking like that in that way. You're actually doing that in that way. So the moment you do put that if an orchestra is going to play a chord together, 4, 5, 6, there are lots of combinations of it, and there are patterns with which you can do. And Andrei Previn did a very good program years ago about showing, and he showed this wonderful book with all these arrows in. He said it reminded him of the Apaches having a war with all these arrows flying through the air, where the stick was going. But what it is that you try and show the players, if they have, for instance, 4 beats in a bar, you show them what part of the bar you are on, whether they're on the first beat, the second beat, the third beat, or the semaphore. So if the players look up and they see you there, they know they're on the same. That I, as a conductor, I do the most wonderful decorating of doors. I'm perfect for doing doors with gloss paint. You're used to doing 2 in a bar in that way. This 2, 3, 4, and all sorts of complications. And of course the fade bum bum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. You do 5 beats in a bar that way. So when the players go ya da 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 semaphore, you're landing the plane on the aircraft carrier. All right, well, we'll put our head down and count like mad, and there's a lot of it about, but basically there's a lot of people with a very good technique to show the players, and whether you like it or not, sometimes players do actually appreciate that, because they, at the end of the day, they do like to be told and shown where they are and what you do. So that's it. The score has got the map. The score has got the map of what you do. You have to then see with your inner ear, you have to listen to what's going on, and you have to correct it, because not all the players are going to be playing the notes correctly. Somebody may have the wrong instrument. They may even be in the wrong piece. It happened the other day that there was a piece where there were 2 versions in one part, and I thought there's something going on here, and I pointed out to the second one that she was actually playing the wrong version of Mendelssohn's. This can go on in this sort of. You've got to have an ear to be able to actually identify on that, and that's difficult. That's difficult. You've got to be able to identify and correct mistakes, and it's not easy to do that. You have to be able to have an ear for it. You have to know how it goes. You've got to be able to deal with all of the problems that will come about with players. I mean, not every orchestra can play as fast as the London Symphony Orchestra if there's something that has to be played fast. So you have to accommodate that. There may well be a player who's sick, who has got a breathing problem or a cold, and they'll say, can you just get on with that phrase? Many a time I've gone through a phrase a bit quicker because I know the player is actually not very well. That can happen. That's part of life. That's part of it. And it's this whole business of, of marking up, knowing what's wrong, and how things work, and identifying what's going on and listening. And it's very easy for referees, like we all are, we're referees off the pitch. It's very easy to tell the referee what's going wrong. But when you're on the pitch and you're on the box and you're the referee and you're running the show, you are actually in that position of being able to say, what's wrong. And you've got to do, and it's difficult. And it's very difficult. And you may come up with something, and there may be lots of mistakes that happen, and you don't want to keep stopping. They want to play, and above all, as Colin once said to me, don't ever forget that an orchestra basically actually wants to play well. They do actually want to play well, and that, and the willful days have gone. I mean, they really have gone. The conductors behaved very, very badly, and there's been all sorts of issues recently about the abuse that's gone on with some musicians that have happened. But I mean, goodness only knows what would have happened years ago. And of course, don't forget, I mean, when I was 21 and I was in the LSO Bernstein Verdi Requiem, I think there was one lady in the LSO. And times have changed, and now the whole mentality of it has changed, and the way things are for the better. Perhaps the discipline isn't so there within an orchestra. I don't know. People don't like being put together. It is the last bastion of authority. I'm basically musically trying to create enough genteel power for me to persuade players to play it as I see this music should go. And that is hard to do with the techniques of that. For instance, there are a lot of people who do this all the time. Now, I would have thought it was quite common knowledge that if the music is soft, you would do that. And if you got louder and crescendoed, you do that. And if it was loud, you do that. But you see an enormous amount of that. And please, Maestro, you're actually conducting loudly. But that's it. So go on now. Now, first of all, you need to have a start. Won the Olympics, my friend. But you have got the body language is very important. I mean, Previn told that wonderful. He used to come on, do one, and he came on. And he'd start, and you'd somehow know he was walking on in the speed of the music. He'd go like this. It'd be in the tempo of the piece that he was doing, you know? But there we go. So, go on.
Don't look at me.
Well, now you've given, you know that you're doing 4 beats, but the orchestra don't. Because, right, as my grandson says, down, left, right, up. For 4 left. So get the stick to bounce. So if you want to ever practice it, the best thing you can do is to bounce a ball on the ground. When you tap the ball, then the beat will come down. 1, 2, 3, 4. Down, left, right, up. Down, left, right, up. That's not bad. That's it. Good. I mean, talking of pianists, Vladimir Ashkenazy, what an artist. He's a very good conductor, insofar as that he knows how to work the orchestra and work it, but he's got no rubbish. He's not got much of a technique to actually do it, and he admits it. Bless his heart. He's so honest about it. He admits it. But all right. So 3, 1, 3. Now down like a pyramid. Go across and down, up. 1, 2, 3. 1. That's down, up. That's it. Let the stick go. Right. Now go quiet. Now do a crescendo. Bring in the horns. Bring in the horns. Why do you have to use your backside to bring in the horns? Down, left, up, and then the horns over there, yes? All right? Bring their horns. I was doing the carry-on in the first round in Bern, Germany, and I was Brahms 2, and the horns come in the next bar, da da, and I went la da, and then I realised that in Germany the horns are over there, so I went da 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 da, in this wonderful choric. Right now, let's put on. I'd love you to hear my dear teacher Sir Adrian doing, but then we'll finish, and I'll hand over to them. Hand over. This is Sir Adrian Boult recording an opera, complicated piece, because you do operas in different bits and pieces and sessions. This is Vaughan Williams' opera, The Pilgrim's Progress. He was about 86 at the time when he was doing this. He wouldn't have known it, but this is him rehearsing. And they kept the tapes running when he was sorting things out about what to do and rehearsing. It needs to be loud enough to be able to hear what he's saying. But he's having a lovely repartee with the orchestra. And this is down in Kingsway. If you go down, there used to be the Central Kingsway Hall. The recording was in there. There's lots of recordings halfway down Kingsway on the Methodist Hall there. Loads of recordings were made in there. Now it doesn't exist anymore. But it was the best acoustic in London to make. The only problem was that you could hear the old Aldwych line used to run. You could hear the odd rumble now and again underneath. But this is Sir Adrian at his best. And do listen to him, because he's very, very, very funny.
The opening of the Allegro, well, the first violins only.
No, that's
matter.
You get the next one, the last one. I'm sorry. I'm just having to make a little prune.
At business 10 is all right. But everything else practically, except the treatise, is too loud. I think the whole thing, we want to get back to our accompanying quality. I'd like to try 1 or 2 places just to be certain about it. I'm making an almighty noise with my coffee because I want to try and learn it. But we'll see. I may have to take yours. But I think if I hit this about a little more now, it'll settle down.
The score was stuck in the other side of the table.
There was a tremendous noise.
Sorry?
There was a tremendous noise at the end in the flute solo of people turning scores.
Sorry, it was only one person turning a score.
Was it?
See, if I do that enough, I think it's... Right, where were we? 4. That's the background. 4. I think your piano is a bit vigorous. I mean, your forte, about 4 bars back. Just a little more, but not too much. So that's the kind of thing we want all the time now. Now, concerning this dotted quaver and semiquaver, I think you know when you've got it separate. We'll try it anyhow, a bit shorter. Your entry, first and seconds after 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th part. 1. Now, keep it moving. Oh, stop. You know, people, you are getting worse and worse. You don't pay slightest attention. You go on playing, you talk like market.
Musician too, to know what you're doing. You don't just conduct the symphonies, you know other the composer's music, which we shall never really get to grips with. What makes it, I don't know. What can't explain everything, like other things we can't explain as well. Thank you very much indeed. Please have a look at the scores in this brief moment before we play. Just if you want to, I don't know, is that the plan, or do you want to go on with the music straight away? It's up to you entirely.
It's sort of only just past 3:30, so I mean, you know, we could just have a quick top up the drinks if you want. I think.
Can I ask you?
Okay, yes, please do. Yeah.
First of all, for my own entertainment, and that is, what do you think of 2 conductors that I have enjoyed enormously? One is Gunter Bunt.
Yes.
And the other one is Marius Janssen.
Oh, well, Janssens I met, yeah. Janssens. Terrific talent.
As a conductor.
Oh, yes, I would rate them very highly. Vance was a great, and took a long time to be established, but his understanding of Bruckner was phenomenal, and a great understanding of the German classics. Yes, quite dour and demanding and pernickety, and that in his way, but they loved him at the BBC when he conducted there. Yes, great. And Marius Janssen was, of course, his father was a great conductor too, Arvid Janssens, who had the same heart condition, and his father died on the box. Yes, and Marius had a heart condition for years. He tried to sort it out, and then nothing that could be done for him. Bless him. But yeah, he was a charming man. He was the first. I was in the Karajan competition. He was in the one just a bit before me. He won it with Karajan, and Karajan thought the world of him, and so did I. I mean, when I was conducting in Petersburg, I saw him conduct I went and met him there, and I didn't know him well. I didn't know him. I mean, he would have known me from Adam, but we met. But I had great admiration for him. Very, very talented conductor. Very talented indeed.
Another interesting thing is the difference between being a conductor with an orchestra that is publicly funded in some sort of way by the government or whatever, and subscription orchestras that you have in America, where the wife of a very powerful
Mahler story in the Mahler's years in New York, was a nightmare with the ladies' committees. I'm not being, forgive me, sexist, but it was like that, wasn't it? It was. They were run in this way, like, you know, the Roosevelt family and all the various people in the States. A lot of the orchestras were run in that way, and incredibly autocratic too. And Edwards, yes, absolutely, was sucker conductor of the whim, and the players as well. All sorts of problems. Cleveland was the same.
And of course, another thing that conductors have to face under these new orchestras here, the LSO, I believe, is one. Socialism has struck the arts, where the whole orchestra determines what should happen.
Well, they do and they don't. Yes, I mean there is much more of a collegiate way of doing things at the moment. I think, you know, I mean if a player has got to do something and that player would say to you, "Could I please do this sort of thing?" You'd say, "Yes, fine, let's do it." I happened to be in Berlin with the competition. I was doing Petrushka, and the orchestra came up to me and they said, "Look, there's a terrible 5/8 bit at the end," and they said, "Well, actually, when we play this, we do this. Would you mind doing it in crotchets?" And I said, "Of course not." And I did well with it. They loved me. I got the orchestra's vote to win it. I didn't get the competition, but because they liked the way that I took on board what they say. Exactly, that's a collegiate way of doing it. But there are some people who won't take any. You know, Boulez was one. You know, I mean, David Butt first flew to the BBC Orchestra. Was once said to Boulez, you know, rehearsing. He said, "Maître, if you could please, would you, instead of doing 4, would you do that bar in 8? It would help us, you know, here." And it was a very gentle man. He wasn't a bolshy orchestral player. And Boulez said, "No, I always do it in 4," and that was that. So the orchestra went, you know, and that was it. I mean, he lost them by simply that complete, you know, "This is the way I do it." No, thank you very much indeed. If a player that you ought to respect asks you to do something, you more these days, I think that would have happened even with other people as well. But you don't have that attitude, no. Well, the Vienna Philharmonic, don't do this. The saying is, "Don't disturb the Vienna Philharmonic." That's the saying. Yeah, they are. They are like that. Yes, they are very like that, and it shows it by the fact that they're gradually getting women involved in it. But a lot of the women involved in it are not actual members of it all, you know. I mean, well, I won't tell you what Colin Davis used to say when he was off to the Vienna Philharmonic, but it was quite rude, and it involved certain, you know, never mind. But he said, you know, it was like that, yeah. So they are like that, yeah. And American orchestras can be tough as well. New York Phil. But they get this attitude. But there's a gang, isn't it? You see, it's the gang mentality. They're all there against you on the box. You know, "We'll eat you for breakfast. We're going to do it." Yeah, exactly, you know. You might think that you're going to make us play Beethoven 5 that way, but we're going to make damn well sure you don't, you know, or something. But those days are basically gone. But you're quite right about the LSO. It's got much more cooperative. But I mean, for all the comings and goings with Simon and the LSO and how the orchestra play and what they do, I mean, he's telling they're basically cooperating with what he would like to do and what he wants to do. Yeah.
These days, orchestras make their own recordings.
Well, absolutely, there's a lot of that going on as well. Yes, they're doing a lot of that. The LSO was a prime mover of that, of putting out their own label, and it's done well. Unfortunately, the LSO just happens to have to make the records in the Barbican, which Colin used to say, you know, the Echo, it destroys the will to live. You know, I mean, there's just no resonance whatsoever. You know, exactly. Yeah. But I'm glad you like Vandt. Yeah, Gunter Vandt. If I wanted to do another Bruckner, I would listen to Vandt doing it. Yeah,
What I find about him is that he, for you, helps the listener understand the architecture.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes. The broad sweep. Yes.
That when you start at the beginning,
Yeah.
get to the end, there's a deep feeling of satisfaction.
It was like that with, yes, exactly. It was like that with Bolt. A lot of conductors aren't like that. But Bolt was like that as well. I tell you who I admire on that front very much, and you might be surprised, is that I find that with Papano at the Opera House. Yeah. I think he's got a great, I mean, there's lots about what he does that's not very precise. But I went to some performances, and there is that sweep. Bolt called it that big sweep from beginning that encompasses the architecture, as you say, of the work. And Vandt was like that, exactly. Yeah.